Although I've heard many stories from my uncle about his time as an EMT, this is the story that will stick with me until I die. About 6 years ago, my Uncle Vinny's paramedic crew responded to a call from a hotel in Philly. And it was one of the more horrific experiences he's had. The initial report stated that a maintenance man named Mike went to check on room 417 since water had been reported flooding into the hallway, and it was he who found the body. Mike informed 911 that there was a man in the in-suite bathroom who appeared to be deceased, and he was all but hyperventilating as he tried to make this report. Mike relayed that he saw the man and immediately backed out of the room, being careful not to drop his phone into the several inches of water on the floor. My uncle's 2-man paramedic team entered the room about 12 minutes later, and they almost gagged at the smell of feces and burning flesh. Vinny, who has a stomach of steel, had to press his hands to his mouth to keep from vomiting. The room was filled with steam, and the humidity was instantly making the men sweat profusely. Their grip on their equipment was slipping, and they knew they needed to extract the victim quickly. The naked man was floating in the hot tub, a maniacal grin plastered across his face. From the looks of the man, he'd been in the water for a while, since his bruised skin was starting to peel off of his body in long, squishy strips. Vinny held his breath and checked for vitals, while one of the other EMTs went to get a bag for the body. Even though my uncle saw corpses regularly, this method of death was a disturbing first for him, and something about the whole situation was unnerving. As Vinny placed his fingers on the man's wrist, expecting to feel nothing, he had to choke back a startled scream when the victim's hand shot out and grasped his arm. It wasn't a corpse. The John Doe didn't show any other signs of being responsive, but when the other EMT went to check the man's eyes for a dilation reaction, his pupils, they looked slitted, almost like those of a reptile. Vinny was weirded out, but dismissed it as a side effect of getting boiled alive, like a hard-boiled egg. As the men removed the victim from the hot tub, the man began to thrash, strips of flesh splattering on the EMTs. They tried to pin the man down to keep him from hurting himself, but he was shockingly strong. As the last bits of flesh dropped to the floor, Vinny saw that it wasn't skin underneath. It was more like scales. His partner must have noticed too, because both men began screaming, almost in unison. The thing began to growl, and my uncle's normal desire to figure out the problem turned into sheer fight or flight, with flight winning out. He ran from the hotel room, his teammate on his heels. They slammed the door behind them, and a moment later, they heard one of the windows shatter. The men had no idea how to explain to their boss what had just happened. But after some phone calls and a few men in black suits appearing, they were given a specific story to follow. They were told to say that a John Doe tried to drown himself, and that the mentally unhinged man climbed down the fire escape when his attempt failed. Vinny, who was paid extra well to keep his mouth shut, never did tell anyone about his story until he shared it with me the other day. I could tell he didn't want to, but I was the only one in the family that he thought would believe him. The only reason he even shared his ridiculous story is because he thinks something has been stalking him the last few weeks, and he's worried that the creature has returned. I thought he was crazy until I went to his house yesterday. I saw a trail of bipedal, clawed footprints footprints underneath his windowsill. A few weeks ago, my boss, Patty, shared a few of her paranormal experiences while we closed down the restaurant. She's in her 70s, and her family owned and operated an actual haunted hotel when she was growing up. It was built in 1927, and it's still one of the nicest hotels in town. I've never stayed there personally, but I thought it would be fun to share Patty's stories. I didn't know what party lines were, not until Patty explained how she had to share a landline with other people. Multiple families would share a single phone line back in the day. It was wild. Their hotel didn't have physical phones in each room, but they had one in their residence, and it was the same line as the phone at the front desk. Sometimes, guests would complain of a young girl speaking into the phone, and it was assumed to be Patty or her sisters. The hotel already had a reputation for being haunted, so guests assumed it was a gimmick. But Patty and her family heard it sometimes too. How often the girl spoke varied from several days in a row to months of total silence. Most of the time, the girl called out, "Hello," as if she wasn't sure anyone was there. But no matter what they replied, it was like she couldn't hear them. There was also a handful of times that the girl was crying, and the longer they listened, the louder it got. And Patty still seemed shaken by recalling the young girl's plea for help. She was 10 when she heard it. She'd answered the phone while her mom was cooking. It was only her aunt, but the connection sounded fuzzier than usual, like someone crumpled a candy wrapper in the receiver. Her aunt's voice was barely audible, but then a clear, distinct child said, "Hello?" Before she could reply, the static spiked and the sobbing began. Patty tried to ask what was wrong, and her mother grew concerned by the panic in her voice. Before the phone was taken, she heard the crying child's desperate pleas for help. She dropped the phone and tried to run away, but her mother caught her by the arm, telling her to wait a second as she put the receiver to her own ear. No one was there. The aunt arrived in a panic 10 minutes later, having assumed Patty screamed for help. When she tried to call back, she couldn't get through, yet other calls had come in just fine. They never learned the poor girl's name, but they believed she was the child of a construction worker. When the hotel was built, they didn't have safety codes or workers' union. Immigrants were cheap, easy labor, and often taken advantage of. One of the builders was a widower with a young girl, maybe 4 or 5. But they were homeless. He set up camp near the river, but the child was too young to be left alone. A foreman took pity on the man and allowed the girl to stay in one of the completed rooms during the man's shifts. For weeks, the man fed his daughter, left her in the room with a sack lunch, and worked until dusk. For weeks, he retrieved her sleeping form and carried her to the camp they called home. Until one night, she wasn't there. At first, he thought she'd wandered out, maybe searching for an outhouse. The foreman collected men for a search party, but no one could find her. They searched through the night, and the next day, she was so young, she couldn't have wandered too far, not alone. They concluded she must have been kidnapped and expanded the search radius, but she was never seen again. A few years later, the foreman was arrested for kidnapping an employee's daughter. He never confessed to taking the first, but people believed he did. Some people have wondered if her body is buried beneath the hotel's concrete foundation. Her father never left town. He couldn't give up the last hope of finding his daughter, but when he learned of the foreman, He walked into the jailhouse with a shotgun. They say that no one tried to stop him, not until he turned the gun on himself, but they couldn't get to him in time. Both he and the foreman died that night. Sometimes, when the ghost was particularly active, the customers would tell their friends and they would have people walking in off the street just to use their phone. Most believed it was fake, but they still paid for the experience, so Patty's family went along with it. There was only one time they had a genuinely unsettling experience. An older man, probably in his 50s, he came just before 10 p.m. while Patty was watching the front desk. His appearance was almost inhuman. He was bald, incredibly tall, dressed in a black suit, and his ears looked plastic. His nose was pointy, almost like a bird's beak, and his top lip looked like he had corrective surgery. Paired with his small, dark eyes and non-existent chin, he appeared almost alien. Patty was terrified the moment he entered the lobby. She managed to ask if he wanted a room, but she could barely get the words out. That's not what he wanted, anyway. He wanted to use the telephone. His voice, like his face, was void of emotion, almost robotic. After a brief pause, he added, "Please," as if saying it was an annoying requirement. Patty squeaked out a timid, "Yes, sir," but her voice was barely audible as she placed the phone on top of the counter. The moment it was in his sight, she ceased to exist. He bent down, bringing the tip of his pointed nose just above the receiver. She heard him inhale deeply several times, breathing it in as one would their favorite scent. She didn't move or speak. She had a terrible feeling that she shouldn't. He kept pausing to turn his ear to the base, like he was listening for something. After smelling every part of the phone, he removed a handkerchief from his breast pocket, and with great deference, he picked up the receiver to carefully inspect every inch. When satisfied, he placed the receiver on the desk and began dialing a number, still using the handkerchief. She thought that he was choosing numbers at random. He never spoke to the operator, and he dialed enough numbers to call China twice. It shouldn't have worked, but then he picked up the receiver once more, and holding it a few inches from his ear, he said, "Hello? Yes? No? 38 GP? Yes?" And that was it. Patty heard something on the other end, but it was so distorted, she couldn't tell if it was words or something else. The man in black retrieved a small notepad from his pocket, unclipped the attached pencil, wrote for a moment, and left without a word. When she told her father, he asked staff members if they saw the man, but no one else had, and they never saw him again. They didn't know if he was a ghost too, or just a man with a screw loose on vacation, but Patty had never heard of the men in black until I told her about them. Maybe someone here can tell us if that might be what this is.